deacon in the Florida Conference. So I am going to talk to you a little bit about the Wesley brothers, John and Charles, today. And one of the things that really resonates with me about them is that the Methodist movement, the importance of compassion and justice, which are part of my call as a deacon, are so evident in why they did what they did. And also, I'm a campus minister who works with young people, and the value and voices of young people is all over our early Methodist movement. So John and Charles Wesley were born in the early 1700s in a little village called Epworth in England. And even though their father was a clergyman, their mother was undoubtedly the most important spiritual influence in their lives. Susanna Wesley had many, many children and highly prized education for all of them, including the girls, which was unusual for the time. She also took an hour every single week to meet individually with each of her children to discuss their spiritual lives and well-being. And that kind of seriousness, we see the foundation that plays in John and Charles Wesley's life. So, for instance, Charles went off to college, and he was really dissatisfied with how casually most other folks seemed to view religion. And so he found a group of friends and asked his older brother, John, to help facilitate a small group for these college friends. They read the Bible together, they studied the classics together, they prayed and they fasted. Not only that, they taught orphans how to read. They made sure to visit those who were in prison. And for this dedication to living out their faith, what happened? Their peers made fun of them. And that's actually where the term Methodist originally comes from. It was an insult used against this college small group for the way they sought to live and serve God in every hour of their lives. And so what was at the core of that dissatisfaction that Charles and John and their college friends had with the Anglican religion that was around them? It was really twofold. The Anglican religion of that time in the early 1700s really didn't seem to take sin seriously enough. The impact of both our individual sin and the sins and wrongs of society, and also did not seem to take grace seriously enough. The grace that God extends toward us and the way that we are called to respond to the world in light of that grace. So that was truly what they were dealing with and responding with in the environment around them. And so a few years later, in the late 1730s, John Wesley's friend from those early small group days, George Whitefield, called him up and invited him to begin field preaching with the coal miners in Bristol. And at this time, preaching out in the open air, not formally part of a church with an invitation to a pulpit, was pretty scandalous. And so John had to wrestle with it for a little bit before ultimately deciding to submit to be more vile, right? To do something improper for the sake of the gospel. And he began preaching to coal miners in Bristol, meeting poor working class folks where they were. And this was a marker of religion at the time as part of things like the Great Awakening and revival movements that maybe you heard about in school. And so John Wesley wasn't unique in choosing to do that. But the thing that was unique is while most folks would preach and then leave, John ensured that anyone who had been transformed by the preaching that they heard in the fields were then organized into small groups so that the transformation could continue. So much of John Wesley's work was in the organization of lay leaders to keep these small groups meeting and strong and doing exactly what they needed to do to form people. One of my favorite things about John Wesley is this holistic care for the poor. He wrote this book called The Primitive Physic, which provided a bunch of herbal and home remedies for common ailments so that folks who could not afford to meet with a doctor would have options to be able to heal those minor coughs and colds and headaches and things like that. So John spent most of his time writing, preaching, organizing, whereas Charles Wesley, he was an amazingly prolific hymn writer. And the singing of these songs and the way they were passed from group to group, that's the way that most folks learned Methodist theology, right? It wasn't through John's sermons, it was really through the singing of hymns that Charles wrote. And we continue to sing so many of those songs in church. So why did Methodism, which was supposed to be a reform movement of the Anglican Church, become a denomination, become its own thing? And we can really trace that to the Revolutionary War. So the Church of England obviously had clergy in the American colonies, but in the aftermath of the war, during and after the war, all of the clergy of the Church of England left. And John Wesley was really concerned about all of the Methodist folks, the folks who were part of this reform movement, who had immigrated to the United States and now had no way to receive communion. So that is why he decided to ordain folks and make Methodism its own sort of thing, to ensure that folks living in the Americas could receive communion. So that accessibility of the table is the whole reason that we, American Methodism, exists as its own sort of thing. So in a very brief overview of the life and work of the Wesleys, what do we take away? Both John and Charles thought that Christians needed to take sin and grace more seriously. We must put ourselves in those places where God seems to show up in particular ways, in being with the poor, in taking communion, in all of those things that we call means of grace, which I'm sure you'll hear about in another video. We demonstrate physical and spiritual care for the whole person. This faith that we have inherited, at its best, remembers there is no religion but social religion and no holiness but social holiness. We must tend to our own individual spiritual lives, but never lose the value of community. There's so much more about John and Charles Wesley, about the Aldersgate experience, about their missionary experience in Georgia, really funny and sad stories about how terrible of a romantic partner John Wesley was. And I hope you'll explore some of those things on your own. But for now, that's just a little bit of an intro to the brothers who shaped the tradition that we have inherited and that we